All right. Hello, everybody. Tonight, we're going to talk about cell transport. We're going to talk about how important things get inside of a cell and how things that need to be released from the cell get out of the cell. Let's go ahead and take a look. So first of all, we learned earlier that cell membranes are semi-permeable. And I just want to review really quickly what semi-permeable means. Semi-permeable means that small things can pass through the cell membrane. So if you take a look at that volleyball net, you can see that the basketballs and the tennis balls, they can't pass through, too big. But little things like marbles and BBs and golf or ping pong balls, those can pass through easily. So that's what semi-permeable means. All right, let's review a couple definitions of terms that you might have seen in junior high. The first one is diffusion. Diffusion is the movement of molecules from an area of greater concentration to an area of lesser. I'm trying to move my picture there. To an area of lesser concentration. Imagine somebody spraying some perfume in one area of the room. Those perfume molecules are all concentrated in one spot. And so if you happen to be standing right there, you can smell the perfume. But if you're across the room, you don't smell it until later. Over time, those molecules are moving, and the reason diffusion occurs is because molecules are in constant motion. So those molecules start moving around and they spread around the entire room until they fill the container that they're in, a room in this case. And we say that they've reached equilibrium. And now finally somebody across the room can smell that perfume that was sprayed over here. It has diffused. You see the dye molecules in the diagram here, the pink molecules. They start spreading out and then eventually reach equilibrium throughout the water. Okay, so keep in mind that small molecules can diffuse across the cell membrane since it's semi-permeable without using any kind of cell energy. So take a look at the diagram. All these molecules, they're really concentrated on the outside. So they're going to start coming in and they try to balance themselves out so that we say it reaches equilibrium, an equal concentration on the outside as on the inside. And that's going to become really important in just a second. So what kind of molecules are we talking about that are coming and going in the cell membrane and that can do it without energy? Well, things like oxygen. Oxygen needs to come in so the cell can make ATP, the energy. Carbon dioxide gets made in our cells and it needs to be released. It's like a poison, and we've got to exhale it out to get that out of our bodies. And then water, of course, needs to come and go in our cells. So those can diffuse across our cell membrane because they're really little. Proteins are an example of a molecule that's enormous. It's like the basketball in that previous diagram. They can't pass through the semi-permeable membrane. So if we need proteins to come into our cells or to leave our cells, they have to be transported, and it uses a lot of energy to do that. All right, let me remind you of a term that you've probably also heard of. The word is osmosis. Now, diffusion is any molecule, but specifically when it's water that's diffusing, we call that osmosis. So it's the diffusion of water from an area of high concentration to an area of low concentration. Take a moment to look at this diagram. On the left, we have a beaker, and the dots, those aren't water molecules, those are sugar molecules. Notice that on the left side of the left beaker, there's lots of sugar molecules. So let's just make up some numbers. Let's say it's 10% sugar. That means it's 90% water. On the right side of that beaker, there's fewer sugar molecules. So let's say it's 5% sugar and 95% water. So if you paid attention, the left side has 90% water and the right side has 95% water. That means there's a higher concentration of water on the right side than there is on the left side. If that membrane allows water to pass through, then the water is going to go from where it's more concentrated, the right side, to where it's less concentrated, the left side. So take a look at the second beaker. You see that water has left the one side and it's gathered on the other side. It's trying to reach equilibrium. So it's going from where it was 95% concentrated, or that was its concentration was 95%, and trying to make equilibrium so that we have about 92.5% concentration on both sides of the semi-permeable membrane. So that's an example of osmosis. Well, what does that have to do with biology, KJ, and cells and living things? everything. It turns out that your body needs exactly the right amount of water in it in order for your cells to work correctly. So, just as an example, and there's bajillions of examples, but this is one example. Take a look at the red blood cells in the diagram below. There's 3 different types of solutions. There's solutions that are exactly balanced. There's solutions where there's too much water, and there's solutions where there's not enough water. The first one we want to talk about is called isotonic. An isotonic solution is where the water concentration is the same inside the cell and outside the cell. That's what your human cells really want. That's called equilibrium. And so take a look at the diagram. Do you see that sometimes water is escaping out of that red blood cell? But the same amount of water is entering the red blood cell. So that red blood cell stays the correct shape and it functions perfectly. In a human or in an animal, that's what we want, is for our blood cells to be in an isotonic solution. Now, there's a different type of solution called a hypotonic solution. One of my students said, KJ, when I try to remember the word hypo and what it means, I think of a hippo. And so hippo. A hippo, if you think of what a hippopotamus looks like, it's this big, bloated African animal. Well, let's talk about what a hypotonic solution does to a cell. Look at the diagram below. So a hypotonic solution is where the water concentration is lower inside the cell. So the solution is very concentrated and the water rushes into the cell and it causes the cell to get all big and bloated like a hippo. Smart student who taught me that tip. I've been teaching it ever since. So look at what happens to the hypotonic solution. In the hypotonic solution. That's a problem for a red blood cell. It gets bigger and bigger, and because our cells are like water balloons, they pop if too much water enters into them. That's a bad thing. So what's an example of a hypotonic solution? Distilled water is an example of a hypotonic solution. So distilled water is 100% water. Your cells, I'll just make up a number. Let's say your cells are 95% water and then 5% dissolved substances. So if you put one of our cells into distilled water, water's going to rush into those cells and it's going to cause those cells to swell up and eventually pop. Now, KJ, does that mean I can't drink distilled water? No, it absolutely does not mean that. As soon as you drink distilled water, you immediately mix that distilled water with your saliva and with other things in your body, and then it's no longer distilled water and it's not a problem. But if the water of your blood was actually distilled water, then it would be a problem, but nothing for you to worry about. We'll talk more about hypotonic in just a second because plants really like hypotonic solutions. All right, the last one totally matters. That's hypertonic solution. So take a look at the last diagram on the right. A hypertonic solution is when the water concentration is higher inside of the cell than outside of the cell, so the water rushes out. What on earth could that be an example of? When are our cells going to shrivel up like that? When we drink salt water. So if you're ever stranded on a boat in the middle of the ocean, are you supposed to drink the salt water? No. Does it matter? Can I drink salt water right now? Can I go over into my kitchen and drink salt water? Yeah, it doesn't matter at all because I have other things to drink that will balance it out. But if I have no food and the only thing I have to drink is salt water, that's a problem. And let me give you percent so it makes sense. Let's say, I said earlier, we said that the cell normally has 95% water on the inside. So imagine the cell is 95% water. Salt water, let's just pretend, let's say salt water is 10% salt. That means it's 90% water. So it's 95% water inside and only 90% water on the outside. The water is going to go from where it's more concentrated inside at 95%, and it's going to leave to go where it's less concentrated outside, which is 90%. So what that does is it causes our cells to shrivel up and they don't work correctly. You become dehydrated. Drinking salt water when you have nothing else to drink or eat is very bad for you. You're better off not drinking the water. So those are the things for human cells. And this is another diagram showing basically the same thing. Diagram A shows an isotonic solution. The red blood cell looks perfect. It's ready to function normally. It is what we call maintaining homeostasis, which just means perfect balance, the exact balance that we want. In diagram B, it's like the person drank a lot of salt water. The water is leaving the cell is shriveling up, and it can't function correctly. And then diagram C is like if it were in distilled water or something like that. Water's rushing in, the cell's getting big, eventually it's going to pop. So that's a hypotonic solution. All right, so plants are a little bit different. And the reason things are different for plants is that plants have a cell wall. So they can't blow up like a water balloon can. And that's going to become super important. So it says, because of the cell wall, hypotonic solutions cannot cause a plant cell to rupture. So what you're looking at are two pictures of onion cells, and they've added a little red dye so that we could see the cells a little bit better. So the picture on the left was put in distilled water, which is a hypotonic solution. And the water rushed into the cells, but the cells stayed the same size they always are, because they have a cell wall. It's just that the water pressure increased inside of them. So that water pressure has a special name when it's in a plant cell. We call that turgor pressure. And turgor pressure is really good for a plant because plants don't have a skeleton. Your cells are all squishy and soft. You don't have a cell wall. You don't need a cell wall because you have a skeleton, and it allows your body to stand upright, and you're not this pile of mushy cells on the ground. Plants don't have a skeleton, so they count on turgor pressure, this intense water pressure inside the cells, to let that plant stand upright so it can photosynthesize. So hypotonic solutions, they're bad for us because they make our cells swell and pop, but they're really good for plant cells. It allows them to have high turgor pressure. But now take a look at the other diagram on the right. That's what would happen if a plant were placed in salt water. So think about in the wintertime when we add salt to our sidewalks, to our roads. Eventually in the spring, the snow melts and that salt gets into our soil, and it causes the soil to be all salty. And what that does is creates a hypertonic solution that causes water to leave the plant cells. Well, with water leaving, they lose their turgor pressure and the plants start to wilt. And that is deadly for plants. This is a huge environmental problem in Minnesota. We use so much salt. Salt never goes away. It stays in the environment. And the more we add salt, the more salt we have. So we're starting to get salt now in our lakes and in our rivers and in our soil, and that's a problem for plants in our area of the world. So I wrote down here: hypertonic solutions cause the vacuole, the thing that stores the water, causes it to shrink, so the plant cells wilt. Really bad for plant cells. All right, just a couple quick quiz questions. Which cell has the highest turgor pressure? Remember, turgor pressure means water pressure. And so the one with high turgor pressure is the one that says hypotonic, the one on the right. It also says the word turgid. And then which plant would be wilting because of low turgor pressure? And that would be the one on the far left, the hypertonic solution. All right, just one last thing and then we're done. The difference between passive transport and active transport. When we say transport, we're talking about the movement of molecules from one side of the cell to the other across the cell membrane. So either into the cell or out of the cell. When it's passive versus active, I want you to think about when you're being passive. When you're being passive, you're low energy and just sitting around doing nothing, maybe dozing off a little bit while a boring biology teacher lectures or something. That's passive. Okay, when you're active, you're using energy and you're into it and you're moving around, and that's active. It uses energy. Passive transport doesn't require energy. So there's two types of passive transport. It says right here, when molecules are small, they pass across the cell membrane without the use of cell energy. No, my picture's in the way right now. Let's see. No ATP needs to be used. Okay, so take a look at the diagram. There are two examples of passive transport. Notice it doesn't say ATP by the top two examples. The first one, we see a molecule that can pass right in between the phospholipid bilayer, that's fancy words, of the cell membrane. That's just regular diffusion. Notice it's moving from where they're highly concentrated to where they're less concentrated. That's diffusion. In the next one coming down, that's called facilitated diffusion. In that case, the molecules weren't able to pass through the cell membrane on their own. They had to pass through a special tunnel. It's made out of protein. And so we call that facilitated. It's being helped across, but no energy is being used. It's just traveling through a little tunnel. So both of those are passive transport. Didn't require any energy at all. Now, in the last example, active transport, notice that there's an ATP molecule. That's our battery. That's our cell energy. This form of transport requires energy. So there's two times when we would need to use energy. Number one, if the molecules are really big. If they can't just pass through the membrane on their own and they're really big, where our cells have to actually actively pull them in and transfer them into the cell or out of the cell, that takes ATP. The other time, and this is what they're showing in the diagram, is when the molecules need to go the wrong way. So remember, diffusion is when they go from an area of high concentration to an area of low concentration. That's the direction they normally travel. But in the diagram down below, it's going from low concentration to high concentration. Imagine going from low on a hill to high on a hill. You have to use a lot of energy to climb a hill. Well, that's what's going on here. We have to use energy to push these molecules back the wrong direction if we need a lot of them in one place. So that takes cell energy, and that's called active transport. Ladies and gentlemen, we are all done. Let me know if you have any questions.